is Dr. Kiera Lindsey, and I am a historian and a biographer, and I'm also the current Vice President of the History Council of New South Wales. And with Dr. Mariko Smith, I'm also the co-editor of this new special issue of the Public History Review, which is being dedicated to the Statue Wars, which we are launching tonight. And we're going to launch that tonight by speaking with 4 contributors and by exploring that question, so where are we now, a year or so on from the dramatic events that were associated with last year's Statue Wars? So about a year has passed since so many statues and memorials were defaced and defended across the world during the Black Lives Matter protests that were stimulated and were themselves a response to the police murder of African-American George Floyd on the 25th of May, 2020. So in a moment, I'm going to invite Professor Paul Ashton, who's the Editor-in-Chief of the Public History Review, to say a few words about this issue. And I also want to, but before that, I also want to make a few opening remarks, and then I'll go on to introduce our speakers. But first, I'd like to acknowledge First Nation sovereignty. So acknowledging country is now something that we actively do throughout Australia. It reminds us that the land that we meet on remains unceded and sovereign First Nation land. While this is now a very familiar act of history making, it is something that we at the History Council of New South Wales take very seriously, because it provides us with an opportunity to stop and reflect upon the role of history in our everyday lives. The way, in so doing, we get to think about the legacies of the past and the fact that all over Australia, Aboriginal people have not only survived those legacies, but learned to thrive in myriad ways. And so an acknowledgement is an opportunity to pause for just a moment and to acknowledge their enormous resilience, to pay our respects to elders past and present, and to express our ongoing gratitude for the beautiful country and culture they continue to so generously share with us. So many of us have no doubt feel at the moment, especially if you're living in New South Wales and Sydney, that time and history are happening in a very unwieldy way. Indeed, it seems not only difficult to make any plans, but to keep up with what is going on. For example, when we were putting the final touches to this special issue and we were thinking about how we might launch it, we thought we might even organise a live event, perhaps associated with the brilliant Unsettled exhibition at the Australian Museum, which my co-editor, Mariko Smith, helped to curate, and which was inspired, I remember her telling me, by a desire to figuratively unsettle one of the most controversial statues in Australia, that is the 1879 statue of Captain Cook by Thomas Woolner, which stands just across the road from the Australian Museum in Hyde Park. So when I was thinking about this, I thought, oh, well, what we'll probably do at the launch is explore the various strategies and solutions that have been discussed in the contributions. We'll reflect upon the advances that have been made with consultative and collaborative processes and how different communities are going about the tricky business of reviewing the role of the statues in the world. And, you know, what kind of role these statues really have in a society that is increasingly demanding, but also resisting these impulses for greater truth-telling and better justice for people, particularly who have been denied that justice in our societies. And yet, in late May 2021, almost a year to the day of the police murder of George Floyd, 3 First Nation communities in Canada announced that they had used ground-penetrating radar to discover the unmarked graves of at least 1,000 First Nation children on the grounds of former resident schools. It soon transpired that there may be as many as 15,000 graves of First Nation children who died of starvation, neglect, disease, and perhaps also deliberate cruelty before being buried in these unmarked graves throughout these residential schools. And in fact, that history is not even that past, because the last of those schools closed in 1996. While formal apologies have been very slow in coming, apparently, authorities have been quick to seek a quiet financial restitution following the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But questions continue about how a nation comprising such devastated First Nation people and those who dispossess them will come to terms with this horror. Perhaps then it's not a wonder that on Canada Day, less than a fortnight ago, that is the 1st of July 2021, crowds wearing orange t-shirts rather than the trademark red and white t-shirts usually worn on that national holiday, poured into the courtyard of the National Legislature and focused their rage, their righteous rage, their misery, their grieving and their demands for justice and truth by tearing down a statue of Queen Victoria and a smaller one of Queen Victoria. Now, while the statue of Queen Victoria had been graffitied and then quickly cleaned up on Canada Day in 2020, I think this image is particularly striking, with it being cleaned up very quickly the next day. This year on Canada Day, so when those crowds came in, they pulled down the statue, cheering "No pride in genocide." And this time, just less than 2 weeks ago, the authorities let it be. And I think this is something to really think about when we ask this question. So where are we now? And there is the image of Queen Victoria, Queen Elizabeth, defaced and lying on the ground. So "No pride in genocide" is the very same phrase that the Milleroy artist Travis Debris graffitied onto the plinth of the Cook statue in Hyde Park in the graphic art studio, which features for the cover of our special issue. That is Volume 28, Statue Wars, Protests, Public Histories, and Problematic Plinths. I guess what I'm trying to say in these open comments is that this issue is not really about statues. It is, as many of our contributors acknowledge, about how we negotiate the bigger, more hotly contested understandings of the past and its impact right here and now. These are pasts that have been suppressed and denied, that are now quite figuratively and literally coming up to the surface and demanding to be seen and heard and acknowledged. Many contributors in our collection provide us with potent examples of how public historians have been contributing to this process of reckoning over the years and how they're doing it right now. In so doing, they remind us that public history is never only something that's done by people with history degrees or professional appointments. And I think that goes to the spirit of public history review more generally, but that public history is done by artists and activists, by protesters and politicians and police, by those who deface and those who defend these statues. So in many different ways, we're all making sense of the past and therefore we are making history. One of the things I find particularly striking about this collection is the care with which our contributors are reflecting upon and engaging with these questions in active but considered ways. They remind us that public history is not only about speaking out and being heard, but also learning to very carefully listening. And with that in mind, I'm going to hand it over to Paul Ashton and listen to him. So hopefully all of you know Paul Ashton. He's a professor of public history. He's been the editor-in-chief of Public History Review for over 30 years. And he won the History Council annual citation in 2020 for decades after decades of generous contribution to history in Australia, particularly New South Wales. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Kiera. Hello, everybody. Thank you for attending tonight. It's great to see this special issue of Public History Review coming out. Very timely. Kiera and Mariko were brilliant in terms of being able to turn around quite a complex and large volume very quickly. And we're very pleased to be able to sort of show the way in which we're trying to push the envelope of historical work and understanding to include a whole range of people that for many years have been excluded from the history profession or the world of history. We've got journalists, a whole range of people, contributing to this volume. It's already getting really good downloads, so its impact is going to be, I think, very significant over time. And it's just great to see the sort of energy that's been brought together around these really critical issues. Next year is actually the 30th anniversary of Public History Review. Paula Hamilton and I and a group of people in the Professional Historians Association set it up. We established it in 1991 and published the first issue in 1992. And it's been a steady, slow plod, basically, trudging to keep it moving on, but we've done that. And we're hoping to see the sort of broad church of history that we promote continue into the future. Anyway, I'd really like to congratulate our guest editors, and I don't want to go on all night. I'll leave it to our wonderful panelists to say lots of interesting things. So thanks, Kiera. That's great.
Thanks. So our very first speaker is Dr. Mariko Smith, who's also the co-editor, as I hope you know, but of this special issue. And Mariko is a Yuin woman with Japanese heritage. She undertakes interdisciplinary practice, which encompasses museology, contemporary art, visual sociology, research methodology, epistemology, and history. Mariko has also worked in the museum and tertiary sectors in Sydney, specialising in Aboriginal cultural heritage, community-based cultural resurgence projects, and incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing into the museum and art practices. As well as co-editing this issue, Mariko has contributed a piece to the issue, which is entitled, "Who Controls the Past, Controls the Future." So over to you, Mariko.
Thank you, Kiera and Paul, and everyone here, the fellow contributors. So Walawani Ninjuwan, so hello everyone in the Durga language of my people, the Yuin nation from the south coast of New South Wales. And so I'm here on the lands of the Darug Guringai peoples in the northern part of Sydney. And yeah, so just going to be talking a little bit about the work I've been doing regarding dialogical memorialization, but even just to step back a little bit more and discuss the introductory chapter that Kiera and I did, where we, really started this discussion with that Woolner sculpture of Cook that stands in Hyde Park. And as Kiera said, I work at the Australian Museum, which is opposite this statue, and walking past this statue on my daily commute, well, that's not happening at the moment, but yeah, so it's a daily reminder for me when I commute in and see that statue. It's a reminder of, I guess, the memorial landscape in Sydney, but also it reminds me of why I do the work that I do. So as a First Nations curator who, engages with history and, these ideas of contested histories and complex histories. And by presenting in our introduction the 3 different ways of viewing the Cook statue. So, Kiera found this, great case study about 1879 with the Cook statue being, created and formally, launched, kind of like our issue tonight, launched in a big fanfare and special ceremony. And then you compare that to the imagery from last year with, right in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement last winter, with the police just absolutely swarming that same statue. And it just, you look at the juxtaposition of those images, and then you throw into the mix Travis de Vries' amazing image of the pulling down of the statue. So I think, just the visual sociologist in me just sees, that sort of montage or, the juxtaposition of those 3 images. Just really powerful. But just coming back to my article, so similarly to Bruce Scates, who's speaking here tonight as well, I'm really interested in a dialogical approach to memorialization. And, dealing with that issue that Christine raises about, should statues stay or should they, go? And that sort of contested, not just the contested histories about these statues, but the contestation about whether they should still exist. So just with the title of my paper, I was inspired by, the quote from George Orwell's 1984. So, that quote about, who controls the past, that party slogan that says that, controls the future. So who controls the present controls the past. And so that idea of, creating an internal present. So one where there's no history that disagrees or provides a dissenting voice, and by making it look like nothing had ever changed. It was designed to stop people from being able to imagine that things could be better or different in the future. And I'm trying to refocus on looking at how the past makes us uncomfortable, but it also accommodates change, and looking at history in a dynamic way. So that's why in my paper, I'm unpacking that dialogical memorialization approach, which is an additive rather than a subtractive approach. So that idea of adding to the memorial rather than necessarily taking it away. Because when we came to that question about what happens when you remove the statue and about the empty plinth, my response was, well, an empty plinth or field does not automatically create a more just society. So my concern is around that zero-sum game that seems to arise, where if you have a group of people who feel like something has been taken away from them that is part of their sense of belonging or their connection to identity, then it's potentially a recipe for all sorts of issues. And just coming back to the current example with Canada. So on Twitter, I follow a lot of, overseas accounts, so like native Twitter and Black Twitter in North America, and especially with Canada. I recently saw an image someone shared where it's got like a totem pole, and someone had graffitied underneath it, one totem equals one statue. So in response to what's been happening with statues falling in response to the discoveries about the residential schools. And so, that is a classic example of this zero-sum game, which is happening where this sort of subtractive approach. And so, rather I'm looking at it from, I guess a pragmatic way as well, not morally opposed to removal. It's just in terms of, a pragmatic and approach. I think dialogical memorialization is one to consider, and similarly to Paul, the other Paul, so Paul Kiem, who was looking at the Richmond, Virginia sort of avenue of monuments. I also raised that example very briefly, looking at one of the quotes from the historians who was asked about it, where he said that, he thinks that we lack imagination when it comes to talking about memorials. It's all or nothing. It's leave them up or tear them down. And that's something Christine also references, that idea as well, as if there's nothing in between we could do to tell a more enriching story about history. So, I just think there's a lot of potential there. And, I raised some examples. So one is a local case study that happened in my local area. So an example of, dialogical memorialization that I was involved in Hornsby Shire. And so similar to Bruce being, involved firsthand in this process was really quite exciting. And there's just so much potential there. So yeah, Kiera, does it help to just go a little bit into these case studies?
Or I think it would be great. It'll whet people's appetite, hopefully, to go and download the special issue, which is, by the way, public access, no cost to go in and download it. And so it's there you can go and read what Mariko has written in more detail. But I think it would be great to hear about the case.
Yeah, it's really briefly, because I had two interesting case studies. So, one showing that sort of how it could be done in your local area, and also one where how this approach of having things in dialogue. So in terms of just unpacking that concept further, so it's intergenerational dialogue as well as cross-cultural potential as well. And so there's an example in regards to how it's not just this woke strategy that's only emerged in regards to, non-white responses to statues. I also have an example showing a class sort of perspective through that lens of class, how white people too have used this technique, this strategy. So with the one in Hornsby, I came across it with my involvement in the local Aboriginal advisory committee at Hornsby Shire Council, and hearing about, there used to be this Cook bicentenary fountain, known in the area as the Cook Fountain, and it was established to mark the bicentenary back in 1970 of Captain Cook. So we recently had the 250th, and yeah, this is the 200th one. And the plaque basically, it said this fountain was erected in 1970 to commemorate the 200th anniversary of the discovery and exploration of the east coast of Australia by Captain James Cook. And this stood for several decades until, in 2006, the local Aboriginal community and also the local reconciliation group, so that's Hornsby Area Residents for Reconciliation Group, as well as Hornsby Council, came together to find this opportunity to respond to this, this fiction of Cook's discovery, and workshopping together cross-culturally, that they came up with a plaque that would sit alongside that original one that talks about the fountain. And this new plaque reads, Hornsby Shire Council acknowledges that when Captain James Cook claimed possession of the East Coast, the land which is now Hornsby Shire had already been occupied by the Darug peoples for many thousands of years. The descendants of the Indigenous people continue to live in our community. They remain traditional custodians, still caring for country. And this is followed by statements in the respective local languages. And so, I feel like, that's really powerful, particularly with the area up here. It is quite conservative. So I was actually quite, personally surprised that something like this happened, more than a decade ago. And it was really encouraging. And, just talking about how it just opened up this opportunity for the local community to realise that history did not begin in Australia in 1788, and it was opening up an opportunity to learn more from the local peoples who still live in the community. So I work alongside a lot of the local elders and local Aboriginal community members like myself, who might not be from these lands originally, but from other Aboriginal countries and nations, but call this place home. So I guess it comes back to that sense of belonging, but also bringing non-Indigenous people along for the ride too, because it could have been so easy just to take that away. I mean, it's interesting because that fountain actually was eventually removed, and that was because the aquatic centre at Hornsby Park was being developed. So it wasn't removed for any particular ideological reason or whatnot. It was because of redevelopment. And then the plaques were just put into storage. And then we thought, look, actually, it's an opportunity to bring them both out. And what ended up happening was, we created a new plinth, and so it needed a new plaque. So that wording from the 2006 one was reproduced on this new sandstone plaque, and because there's no fountain, it lost its context a bit, that original plaque. But I thought, look, it needs to be acknowledged in some way. So even though the new plinth and plaque was unveiled last year in front of council chambers now, we organised for the two old plaques to be placed in council chambers in a display case. So then that way, that history is still able to be appreciated. I didn't feel like erasing that original 1970 plaque. I just feel like you're missing part of that really great story. Otherwise, you're looking at that new one and you're kind of missing part of this really interesting story. So, and then just to finish off, I don't know how my timing's going, Kiera, but if I can just quickly have a few minutes just to talk about that second case study. So, just really my paper was unpacking this concept and having a sort of play around with how it actually can work practically, and also, to show that point that it's not just something that arises out of, culture wars, racial, wars fodder. Like it's a way to consider it through that lens of power dynamics and class. So I have a bit of an interest in American Revolutionary history, early colonial history, and I came across this monument that's dedicated to Major John Andre. So I don't know if people know their American history. He was the one who was meeting with General Benedict Arnold when he was defecting from the Continental Army to the to the British side. And so Major John Andre was a British Army officer, and he was involved in a lot of the spy games that were going on. And he was caught when he was meeting Benedict Arnold behind enemy lines, and because he was dressed in civilian clothes, he was, convicted as a spy. And so he was hanged at a place named Tappan in New York State. And then about 100 years later, to mark that anniversary, there was an American...
We might need to finish up sort of soon.
Yeah, sure, sorry.
I'll be running a little bit over time.
No, that's all right.
Yeah.
But yeah, there was an American millionaire who decided to build a monument. So that idea of, look, it was on the nose at the time because it was a monument to a British enemy on American soil. And so there was an additional plaque later put onto it, bringing the story about General Washington into the mix and acknowledging the bravery of Washington and his men in, dealing with that crisis of the war with Arnold's defection. And so that is really interesting in seeing how that monument was blown up a few times, but it was still kept and replaced. And having that new plaque in there was a way to stop that destruction and just to acknowledge the multiple sides. So yeah, there's a lot of potential there. And I really look forward to hearing more about Bruce's case study too, and hearing the other speakers. So thanks, Kiera.
Thanks, Mariko. That's fantastic. I think we might move on because we've kind of lost a bit of time there, and we'll come back to asking you a few questions at the very end, if that's okay, Mariko. So I'll just move on to our next person, who is Paul Kiem, who is a former secondary school history teacher and the president of the History Teachers Association of Australia. Paul recently retired as a professional officer of the History Teachers Association, but he is the author of several popular history texts and a long-term editor of Teaching History, and is presented extensively on history and education to teach from student groups throughout Australia. He's also an associate lecturer in history education at the University of Sydney. And in our special issue, his contribution is called Writing History, Monument Avenue, Richard, Virginia. And so this is an opportunity to sort of touch base on Mariko's American examples and explore them in a little bit more detail. So over to you, Paul. Are you still with us?
Thank you, Kiera. Yes. Thank you, and very happily speaking to you from Newcastle tonight, a Wabakal country. Can I begin? I suspect that there are going to be a number of New South Wales history extension teachers, and can I begin by recommending this issue of the Public History Review? I think, as Mariko has already indicated, there's a very broad approach. There's a lot of perspectives taken into account, and we've been looking at statues as a great classroom fodder when we talk about historiography for some time, and some of the examples we use are referenced in a number of the articles. I noticed Hilda Keane, for example, talking about the Wiradjuri men who were commemorated at Gundagai for saving so many people in Australia's greatest flood back in the middle of the 1850s. The mention of statues and imaginative approaches and dialogical approaches. My own favourite dialogic one is the John Batman Memorial in Melbourne, which has been rebadged now at least twice. It's a great example of postmodernist editing of the monument. And I was also drawn to Christine's phrase in her article talking about the alternative: do we obliterate statues, or do we allow time to take its toll, as has happened with ancient monuments? Look, I want to talk briefly about the subject of my article was Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia. I was fortunate enough to visit, courtesy of a New South Wales Premier's History Scholarship in 2002 on another topic, but made a beeline for Monument Avenue because I like monuments and statues and anything about the past representing the past. Monument Avenue is one of the world's nice streets, goes through a lovely area, and down the median strip it had in 2002 these huge monuments to Confederate heroes, Richmond being the Confederate capital during the American Civil War. Why I think these are interesting is these statues were contested from the beginning and politicised from the beginning. So what's happened to them recently is certainly a thing of the moment in terms of a very contemporary historical context. But when they were put up, we don't hear about it now, but there were protests at the time, particularly from Richmond's black community, who had been freed from slavery and allowed to vote and were representing each other in the assembly and so on up until the end of the 19th century, when the franchise was withdrawn or restricted, when segregation was introduced and all the Jim Crow laws and so on. And the erection of the statues coincided with this very backward step. And one of the very eminent black newspaper editors at the time, John Mitchell, said, when you guys are erecting this statue to Robert E. Lee and 100,000 turn up with Confederate flags and so on, you're taking us backwards, you're not taking us forwards. It's a very prescient comment because it took American reconciliation back 100 years. It was only just being dealt with now. Another black politician said, why would I erect a statue to Robert E. Lee when he fought to keep me as a slave? John Mitchell also said at the time, well, black men have put these statues up, they were the workers, and black men will take them down at some stage. And of course, it's come true just very recently. Look, it's a very interesting story that goes on there. From one of the results of the civil rights movement is that you eventually, by the 1970s, do get a black controlled council. And when the black controlled council takes charge of Richmond, one of the councillors said that people got in touch straight away and said, what are you going to do about those Confederate statues on Monument Avenue? And he said, well, the councillors hadn't thought of that at all. It wasn't on their radar because what they were thinking about is schools and jobs and health and education and so on. And that just wasn't a priority for them. You had a change in the 90s when at the end of Monument Avenue, a monument to Arthur Ashe, great tennis player, and former resident of Richmond. And there was huge controversy. And the coded language was, well, you can't put him on Monument Avenue because he hasn't got a horse and a sword. He's not a martial figure. And there were protests about destroying heritage and so on. But people at the time took it as symbolic of desegregation. You had a black man able to join the row of heroes on Monument Avenue. Although another black representative on council said, why should we put him there? It's Loser's Lane after all, for all the Confederate traitors that were lined up there. The statues no longer exist. They came down in a hurry. Apart from Robert E. Lee, his statue is there on state controlled and there's court cases and so on. But it was interesting how they came down. The council had put out a consultation, and the consultation document is online. It's called the Monument Avenue Commission Report. It's really interesting reading, and it surveys a lot of these issues we're talking about. And they were in the middle of dealing with that when the Black Lives Matter protests centred on Monument Avenue, and the person that was in reach, Jefferson Davis, the former Confederate, he was on a low plinth. They toppled him. And the very next day, the mayor said, oh, well, okay, now it's a public safety issue. We can't have that going on, so we'll have to get rid of all the statues, which they did. They took the opportunity, and the only one they couldn't reach Lee. He's up extraordinarily, very great height. So it's an interesting example of the statue wars, and I kind of always ambivalent, I think, has come across already about this idea of knocking down statues, obliterating. People say they're not history. They are history. Statues have their own history. But in the case of Monument Avenue, I would emphasise that it was politicised from the start, and it was part of this public history way of telling the wrong story, the very incomplete, very selective story of the American Civil War, and a remarkable instance of where the losers got to tell the history. For the last 100 years, the losers got to tell the history, and the traitors had statues commemorated to them. They had rooms named after them in West Point Academy and so on. Very unusual. Question was asked, where are we now? This is it's ongoing. There's some very recent events. A couple of weeks ago, I learnt that what do we do with an empty plinth? That's what they're looking at now in Richmond. They've realised that under the plinths are Confederate time capsules that were placed there at the time. And so they're talking about accessing those now and getting inside of the headspace of the people who erected the statues. A couple of weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, I would recommend this video if you can access it on YouTube, How the Monuments Came Down. It's a 90-minute US public television video. It tells the story and it tells the history. And again, if you're teaching students and so on, all of it or aspects of it, very engaging, very interesting history of it. And finally, 2 days ago on Saturday, Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson came down in Charlottesville. So Charlottesville, up the road from Richmond, is where, of course, back in 2017, there was a white supremacist rally that resulted in the death of one person, injuries to many, and was the event that preceded Black Lives Matter leading up to this. In fact, Charlottesville was when a lot of other monuments throughout the South were dismantled. So you may find a video on YouTube seeing Robert E. Lee going for his last ride on a semi-trailer out of Charlottesville. Where they're going to put Robert E. Lee, he's quite ubiquitous, but they're going to have a park somewhere where they put all his statues, and perhaps Joan Baez can write a song about the Robert E. Lee going down.
Thanks, Paul. That's terrific. Such a great overview, and just reminds us that these things are so alive right now. Time capsules being dug up, and statues being dragged off on semi-trailers. It's extraordinary, isn't it? And I love the idea that the statues in America in that instance were taken down not just because of people's protests or council concern and consultation, but under the argument of public safety. It seems like a kind of sidestep that's still got an interesting sort of way of negotiating those challenges. So I think what we might do is just keep moving on and come back to ask questions as a group, because I'm just conscious of the time. So I'd like to thank you, Paul, and move forward to introducing now Professor Bruce Scates, who is based at the Department of History at the Australian National University and a founding executive member, in fact, of the History Council of New South Wales. So thanks, Bruce, for all your work there. He's also the author and co-author of several books on war and memory, and the writer and producer of Australian Journey, a documentary series that explores the history of Australia through objects and is featured on the National Museum of Australia's website. Bruce's other public history engagement include 100 Stories project, which is based at ANU, and extensive media commentary. And in this issue, he describes a project that he began working on in 1988, which represents what he calls, as the title of his article, the beginnings of the Australian Statue Wars. And this involves, as you're going to hear, a counter commemoration at the base of an explorer's monument in Fremantle. So over to you, Bruce. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kiera. Can I begin by acknowledging and by thanking the First Nations communities I was privileged to work with in WA with many others, the Noongar Whadjuk people in Perth, the Kurrajari community up at Bidjadanga. And I acknowledge that I speak to you from what always was and always will be Ngunnawal Ngambri land. You can see it shining behind me there. And thanks to you all. It has been great to contribute to this collection, to share in your fellowship. And I want to say all praise to the editors, all praise to the History Council of New South Wales. And like Paul, I'd like to send a special message to our teachers who keep learning alive and vibrant and strong, even in times of COVID. Well, where to now? And what's the next step on our common journey? Look, it seems to me that every monument, every memorial is actually a place of enormous possibilities. And I mean that in a couple of different ways. Firstly, for every structure that was raised, there was always a myriad of different possibilities. These are what Ken Inglis liked to call the lost memorials, the options that were considered but rejected by communities, commemorative imaginings, if you like, that never actually materialised in bronze or in stone. And we can see a place for possibility too in the way we deal with our difficult heritage as well. There are a myriad different pathways how we might move on from where we are today. Our respective papers, I think, in this collection span that enormous spectrum of possibility and agency. We're talking about the removal of brazenly racist memorials from civil space, the interrogation of what's been called orphaned monuments, I love that phrase, in a museum context, the creation of what my colleague here at the ANU, Peter Yu, has called hybrid memorials, and that cathartic destruction of symbols of white colonialism. I suspect, as for the making of memorials, debate, contention, contingency is going to mark what Inglis again would have called the right way. And the right way, I think, is probably going to be different in different contexts. And that will reflect not just the nature of the monument itself or the wishes of the communities in which they stand. First and foremost, I think we have to respect the aspirations of those maligned and disempowered by these monuments, those who suffered and still suffer the trauma of colonialism, those who bear the weight of that stone. So the point I would like to make is that we have choices. We need not live in the shadow of the past. Where do we stand now in that conversation? What choices might we make? Well, I actually posed that same question in an opinion piece I wrote last year. What might be the way forward? That article asked. And my answer to that question remains the same as it was 12 months ago. Indigenous Australians have shown us the way. Let me expand on that now. Just a few weeks ago, it was my great privilege to attend the Manning Clark lecture here at the ANU. The speaker was a Wiradjuri man who you all know, Stan Grant. It was a brilliant address, wise in so very many ways. And predictably, there were questions about where Stan Grant stands now in the ongoing debate about that statue in Hyde Park and many other statues that are scattered across Australia's commemorative landscape. Now, Stan Grant made three important observations that I think are really germane to our discussion today. His opening remark, though, was the most important of all. The statue I wrote about, the monuments all of us have been considering, are not so much about history, he said, they're about power. They're about power and the representation of power. The monument to Maitland Brown and those so-called murdered explorers in Fremantle was a denial of Aboriginal sovereignty. It condoned the murderous work of punitive expeditions. It described a continent that had been occupied for millennia as an empty land. In short, it was raised as a gesture of white power and white privilege, and that it surely remains. By occupying civic space, that monument and all the monuments we've looked at served to legitimise narratives of conquest and dispossession. They colonised minds in much the same way that white settlers seized vast tracts of territory. So, should they be torn down? That was the second theme that Stan Grant addressed. And no was his unequivocal reply. It's not necessary to destroy these statues, he told us, but rather to understand them. What do they tell us about power relationships in the late 19th century, in the 20th century, even today? Stan Grant understood the impulse to remove them, to grind them into dust, as Julia Baird put it in that brilliant opinion piece. Gazing upon these monuments to dispossession, he felt what he called a pulsating anger running through his veins. But, he continued, they tell us something important, something about who we are. So let's leave them there for what they tell us. Let's see them for what they are. And this is so important, let's write new stories about who we are today. Let's put other things beside those statues. Let's say, where's the statue to Pemulwuy? Where's the statue to Eddie Mabo? Where's the stories that speak to the stories that survive Captain Cook? Because that's where I stand. Well, I think the corrective plaque on the Maitland Brown Memorial is one of those other things that Stan Grant referred to. And like Mariko, like Kiera, I believe there is a very strong case for dialogical memorialisation. Arguably, we should leave these statues in the hearts of our parklands and our cities, because I don't think packing away the past is ever really a solution. We need to confront it. We need to raise new conversations around those granite pedestals. We need to turn those racist symbols of the past into platforms for truth-telling and reconciliation. Stan Grant made 3 points about the statue wars. Can I quickly offer you 3 observations about dialogical memorialisation? To be meaningful, to be effective, a dissenting dialogue has got to be heard. And can I illustrate that with a case from my own campus today? The offices of the Churchill Trust are just down the road here, and flanking them is a massive monument to Winston Churchill. It's a huge Hulk-like figure that's stalking through the university grounds. Now, mindful of the protests that have erupted around this very same statue in Westminster, and I'm sure you've all seen Churchill's statue boarded up in a kind of timber cocoon, the Churchill Trust is commissioning a series of essays that critique the racism and colonialism of the Churchillian mindset. I suspect most Indian students at the ANU don't actually see Churchill as a champion of freedom and democracy. Here again is an instance of a difficult and problematic heritage, a whole range of historical complexities that belie that simplistic, heroic caricature cast in bronze. Or actually, as it turns out, that statue is made of fiberglass and fell apart in the hail. But if dialogical memorialisation is going to work, those dissenting voices have to be given prominence, not just the license to speak. I don't think it's sufficient redress to place an essay online. A link to a website hardly matches the overbearing statement of that statue. My second point is that dialogues begin conversations. They really shouldn't end them. Reimagining history, decolonising the colonial landscape isn't simply a matter of adding new plaques to old monuments. And here again, I concur with what Mariko has said about the need to re-signify these monuments, the need to bend cold stone to accommodate multiple and complex narratives to ensure the centering always of that Indigenous voice. Stan Grant said much the same. Whose stories are being told, he asked, and who gets to tell them? My third point finally looks back again at what Stan Grant said about our situation today. I agree we shouldn't destroy or remove these monuments. They should remain in situ. But we can alter them. We can bring them down. We can unseat those great white men, both figuratively and literally, from their pedestals. Because I think as long as they tower over us, their values and beliefs surely subordinate our own. Again, the challenge and the opportunity of dialogical memorialisation isn't just adding something to an old structure. It should reconfigure the whole memorial space. It should transform and think outside those structures of stone. In that light, I do think it's appropriate that the counter-monument raised in Fremantle, the efforts of so many, is set in the very foundation of the Explorers Monument. Why? Because symbolically, as well as actually, it unsettles and contests that old colonial discourse. Even so, you could argue that more can be done. After all, we still look up at the ennobled figure of a man who condoned mass murder, whose gaze still commands the landscape he wrongly claimed. And his gaze, quite simply, is not our own. And there I'll leave it. Thank you, Kiera.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce. Oh, that's very rich. And I think you've stirred a lot of conversation ideas there. And I'd like to open those up at the end as part of a group discussion. So thank you very much, Bruce. And I'll introduce now our last speaker, Christine Yeats, who is an archivist and professional historian with a particular history, like myself, in women's history. She is the former president of the Royal Australian Historical Society, the immediate past president of the Independent Scholars of Association of Australia, and the immediate past chair of Oh, now what is that? The ISAA, the same association. And she currently convenes the Assessment Subcommittee of the UNESCO Australian Memory of the World Committee. Over the course of her career, Christine has contributed to a wide range of publications and spoken at numerous conferences. And here her very useful contribution is entitled, Should They Stay? Oh, I remember a song of that name. Should they stay or should they go now? And so over to you, Christine.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And I acknowledge that I am attending this meeting on the land of the Gadigal and Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to elders past and present and those here this evening. Yes, I was inspired by the Jimmy Durante song, I have to confess. Additional thoughts really is what I've kind of, as my subtitle for tonight. I began my contribution to this issue of public history review, with a reference to the poems titled Ozymandias, dealing with the trunk and legless shattered face of the long forgotten ruler. And that was inspired by the acquisition of the bust of Ramses II by the British Museum. Interestingly, if you Google Ozymandias, you get some fantastic images. Obviously, someone's imagination, some a little odd. If I'd been doing PowerPoint, I could have put that one in. When I mentioned to a colleague that I was going to be speaking tonight, and I said, "Oh, should I talk about what I've written about, or what should I do?" And partly because I wasn't expecting them to sort of answer in a way, it's more of a rhetorical question, but they said to me, "It's all about intention." And I thought, that's from someone who's not a historian. And I thought, well, that's an interesting, I'll start there. And because I do think that is only part of the issue, but it is a part of the issue. And it's something that needs to be considered when talking about how we manage these contested statues and memorials into the future. And being an archivist, my questions about intention were very much based on archival questions when you interrogate the records. And the first of those was what was intended when it was erected, when the statue or the memorial was erected. Was it to engender fear? And many were. Was it to brainwash? Many were. To glorify the past, even a flawed past, certainly. To exonerate, to celebrate and commemorate, or because someone had a pot of money and they wanted to gain favour, impress the electorate, who knows. There's always a reason, and the reason is important. It's also important when a statue or a memorial was erected. Was it done, as in the case of those for war memorials, as soon as possible after the war? But a lot of the statues, for the Confederate statues, which are highly contested, were erected long after the American Civil War. And therein lies part of the issue. Who wanted the statue? And how was the money raised? Was it government? Was it through private subscription? All of those inform the history. I think also we should consider how these issues and explanations accord with today's understanding and knowledge of the statue, of the memorial. Also, I think we should consider what is being remembered, how it is being remembered within collective memory. And it may be good, it may be exceedingly bad, but that we should record that. And I think the other question is that would society benefit from the removal of a contested statue or memorial, or should it stay? Should it stay with additional plaques, even an accompanying statue, celebrating another historical interpretation? And that has been suggested by some. We can safely assume that the original intention of creating the statue of Ramses II, or Ozymandias, was one of celebration and commemoration. And there is no doubt that this is also true of many other efforts. Time and collective memory have moved on moved on from the statue of the fictional Ozymandias, which was left to disintegrate over many centuries, leaving nothing but ruins. Surrounded by shifting sands, perhaps this was the most fitting home for that ancient ruler. Of course, when I was thinking about this, and I thought, well, you could have a statue that you just left to disintegrate because it was seen as contested. We questioned, we had bad feelings about it. Then I thought, no, we can't just leave statues to disintegrate because they'll probably break down and they'll fall on someone and do more damage. I know it's a sort of a slightly humorous looking at a very serious issue, but I did think about that. Today, allowing for contested monuments and statues to remain is not the best solution, I think, but it could be a solution. You know, it's one of those things. Should it go? Should it stay? And there are a host of reasons for arguing for removal. There are also a host of reasons for keeping a statue there, putting on an additional plaque or something else. And I explored a number of these options in my contribution to this issue of the review, and I won't go through them tonight. When I was doing my preparation for tonight's launch, I came across two very recent interesting articles on the subject. Now, one of them's been touched on already this evening by Paul Kiem, and they caught my attention. They were quite different in approach, and the first was published in The Conversation on the 9th of July, titled The Friday Essay Beyond Statue Shaming, Grappling with Australia's Legacies of Slavery by Jane Lydon and Zoe Laidlaw. Now, largely about slavery, a good article. I'd recommend it to anyone, a good read, because slavery as we think of in terms of capturing slaves from Africa, etc., the history touches Australia, as we know, putting aside the wrongs of blackbirding, etc. And it begins with the comment that as countries around the globe struggle to come to terms with the legacies of their imperial and colonial past, much debate about truth-telling focuses on how we remember individuals. The statues and street names honouring the achievements of eminent white men, and I stress that, white men, are now often seen as monuments to their privilege secured at others' expense. I think there's very few people that would argue with that. When we come to interpret individual lives, it should, if it's done properly, should give us an insight into the historical process. Biography, after all, is one of the most popular forms of history, apparently. And tracing an individual's life certainly does make the past tangible and accessible. Stories of prominent individuals allow people to vividly imagine historic processes such as slavery, exploration, and colonisation. They also depend on who's telling the story, and that's the other problem, really, about written biographies. For historians, and I was thinking about this over a few days, for historians from all areas, those in the academy and right down to those people, those working at a local, through a local historical society, as well as archivists, should heed the whole question about statues and about removal and all of those issues as a rallying call, because it does offer us all of us, an opportunity to take an active role in contributing to the current statues debate. We can offer a very meaningful contribution in the form of both the history and the historiography of the individuals who were the subjects of these contested statues and monuments. Focusing on the past actions of these individuals is problematic. And when I read the article, there was coming through almost a feeling that maybe we've all been too harsh, but I'm not sure. I'm prepared to be put down on that and argue the point. But whatever else, we should in no way excuse the actions of those who have perpetrated what can be best described as crimes of humanity, no matter when they were alive and when they did those actions. So actions must be considered within the context of their times. Yes, we agree, but they must also be considered in terms of the moral question of what is right and wrong. Yes, research should be supported by documentary evidence rather than just reading written biographies and relying on those. And that will assist in giving a better understanding about whether a statue should be removed from a plinth and placed in a museum or a statue park. It would also ensure that future generations understand why statues were removed. The second article that I wanted to refer to is the one that's already been mentioned by Paul Kiem. And one of the comments there was that it said that as long as the statue remains standing in our downtown public spaces, they signify our community tolerated white supremacy and the lost cause of those that those generals fought for. I think that's absolutely hits the nail on the head. The two statues are going to a secure location, and apparently expressions of interest from museums and historical societies are being considered. What is going to happen with the areas, the parks where they were displayed, is that they'll be redeveloped to promote healing and to tell, I guess, a more meaningful and complete history of Charlottesville.
I think we're going to
So really, with no amount of additional plaques can something like that statue of Lee remain. I think there's a case in point where you would argue it should be removed. Removed somewhere and interpreted would be my preferred view. The other thing I wanted to throw into the mix really is just totally from left field is the artistic merit of some of the statues. Some statues and some memorials have been crafted by people who are famous artists. Do we regard them differently from something that's just a prosaic statue? So while it would be tempting to suggest that statues of historical figures could be retained, one person suggested to me to be retained and made so accessible that no one could ever get to them. That sounds a little bit like censorship. There is no single solution, I think, as I really came to that conclusion in my article. Each example should be considered on its own, and the decision should be up to the community. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. Christine, your article was really helpful, I think, in the way you provided a survey of so many different solutions or responses, and really highlighted the point that, we do need to, in a sense, walk slowly around these statues and consider them historically and spatially, and develop case-by-case solutions. And I guess, as all of our speakers have done tonight, I would reiterate the fact that if you're looking for different solutions, potential solutions to apply, as well as frameworks and case studies and consultation strategies that have been developed in different contexts, then the different contributions really offer an overview of those. I want to, we have one question which is from one of our audience members tonight, asking about whether statues should be removed into museums or, as I think I've heard Paul Ashton say a few times, parks of infamy. And we might get back onto that a little bit later, but I wanted to throw a question to you all, which is, why now? What has been going on in the last 18 months or so? We know that, as Anna Clark mentions in her contribution in the issue, that First Nations people, the people who have been most offended and upset by these statues, have been aware of this for a very, very long time. And in fact, in our opening introduction, Mariko and I make the observation that at the 1879 unveiling of the Cook statue in Hyde Park, where there was over 100,000 people there to celebrate this moment. There were described in the crowd as being a few, to use the quote, solemn-faced Aboriginal people. No wonder they were solemn-faced in 1879, right? So there was a response to celebrating Cook then. It's been ongoing. So why is it now? What is it about the last 18 months in particular? The statue wars that reached that kind of climax this time last year. Does anyone want to, it's always difficult for historians to get into the recent past, but I would love to hear some thoughts about why now before we think of where are we and where we might go. What's going on? Does anyone want to jump in on that one? Bruce, you're nodding energetically.
Was not energetically, yeah. I guess it is, as you say, a global conversation. I mean, we've watched these monuments being toppled, and personally, I found that quite cathartic. Watching monarchs fall is a great thing to see, and I think everyone who sees that feels empowered by that. I'm not saying it's derivative, though. I agree with you entirely. These are, and whether it was the 1980s when that work on Maitland Brown was being done, or long before that, communities have found these monuments offensive. It's just that we are, I think, moving into a new stage where we draw inspiration from one another and we see what can be done. And frankly, the mindset's changed a lot. I mean, honestly, the rabid kind of racism that was all too evident in a newspaper in the 1980s is no longer quite as strong. It's still there, but there are more constraints, I think. I don't know how the other panelists feel about that, but I think it's a global conversation.
So is it about something to do with the cultural wars themselves reaching a new sort of crescendo of a different temperature and tone almost? Does anybody else, Christine?
Yeah, only just to add that, which I refer to in my article, in 2015, I know that's not that long ago really, the initiative of the Roads Must Fall, RHODES, must fall. It seems to me that that was probably part two of a movement that was an upswell, I think. It is interesting that I think that we had such a groundswell right across the world during COVID year. I mean, we've still got COVID, of course. Yes, and I honestly don't know. I think it's something that was growing. That's my feeling, that it's an emerging position. And I think George Floyd's death, I think, was one factor. But there were probably, and of course there are too many Indigenous deaths in custody in Australia all the time, and I think a whole lot of issues like that have come together.
I've got a big throw. I mean, I really think that all culture ultimately is local. It has to be local, and social media and digital technologies have allowed us to actually link in to things on the ground immediately. And we've learned very quickly about all these sort of reactions to colonialism and God knows what, very quickly. And there's been massive worldwide responses to it. And I think that's been a critical thing.
Yeah.
The locality, Mariko talked about Hornsby, Bruce has talked about Fremantle. These things, when Bruce wrote, and Bruce and Raylene Francis wrote about Fremantle in the 80s, we'd write each other letters. Dear Bruce, have you got my postcard or whatever? But it's so fast now, and things are just connecting so much more quickly. So that local has become global.
So it's like seeing the prism of the global through the local. And I would say my hypothesis is, why I want to ask this question, is that I think it has been highly accentuated by the fact that in lockdown, our local becomes so much more important.
Absolutely. And I think it's
in the way that some of those statues, when they were designed, it was important then. The local meant what it meant, something similar then. And
it's also underpinned reconciliation because we're looking at local. It's something that's about us. It's around us. It's not something that's an ideology that's nationalised. It's something that's deep down in the backyard.
So a grounding, but also it seems that there is this sort of resurfacing of things that have been hidden or denied or suppressed or deliberately forgotten for a long time that are bubbling up and exploding. You know, like if we look at the example of the Colston statue in Bristol, and we know, as Jess Moody's contribution in the issue reminds us, that statue had been contested for at least 40 years. Absolutely. People have been saying, get rid of it. It's upsetting, it's distressing, it's inaccurate, it's offensive. And so I think it's really interesting what's happened to that. One of the audience members has asked what the panelists think about having statues put into museums. And I want to raise that with all of you. And just to perhaps some of you might be interested in reflecting on or including the Colston statue itself in your reflections, or if not, I will, because that has been now. People just did not know what to do with that statue when it was dragged off and the plinth was left empty. It became a very contested site, a vacuum of power, you know, to draw back on Mariko's comments. And it was then put in a museum, and that's where it is now. But even that is contested about, you know, people feel quite uncomfortable. There's conversation about whether that's an acceptable place. And it's been put, I think, in a kind of context that is about Bristol local history and politics rather than, you know, so it's been recontextualized in really interesting ways. Does anyone else want to talk to parks and museums as a solution for statues?
I would say that if you're going to do that, put them in a museum, that there must be interpretation. You can't just have them sitting there because they'll be just as offensive sitting in a museum, and in fact even more so because they're being given some measure of recognition without proper explanation. I don't think if you're going to have them, they should be visible, but I think definitely have information there that reflects on them accurately. Part of truth telling.
I wonder what Mariko thinks of this, given the role you played in the museum and given the proximity of the Cook statue, whether you feel that it's actually good that you have that monument outside in civic space and you engage in a conversation within the museum, or do you want to draw it within your walls?
Yeah, well, that's something that came up in last year's seminar that, I kind of posed a hypothetical, particularly because I've been involved with, curator Laura McBride on the Unsettled exhibition at the Australian Museums. It is First Nations-led writer reply to the Cook 250th anniversary. And like I posed this idea of, you know, what would happen if we had the Cook statue got removed from Hyde Park and placed in the exhibition? And I think like the contextualization is really important. So like what Christine was saying, you can't just kind of plonk it in. I think it would work. It would be really interesting within the context of that particular exhibition, which is, looking at, different ways of looking at the foundational history of Australia and that memorialization. So I think, within context would be really quite interesting. So within Unsettled, I think it would have, given it quite an edge, I think, to have that statue. Would be very confronting still. And it's interesting because the themes of Unsettled can be seen as confronting, but to have that statue, like, is so big. And it's quite an interesting idea, having it in a museum, but the dangers of it still kind of being venerated in that space. Like, you'd have to be very, I think, curatorially, there's a lot of challenges there. And I noticed that came up with the recent media around the Colston statue about how it was actually placed in the museum, where it had all the red paint on it. And there was a critic who was saying, oh, it looks like a dead person, like really personifying this statue. And maybe it comes down to all those sort of curatorial decisions around placement and context. So I think it's a really interesting one.
Thank you very much, everyone. We've just got time for one last question, and it comes from one of our contributors, actually, Claire Baxter, who wrote a fantastic piece reflecting. So with the provocation that maybe we should think of these statues not so much as historical artifacts, but as archaeological ones. And she used as an example the research that she had done onto the museums throughout Eastern Europe, so the parks, the statue parks, and made the argument for the fact that there needs to be many, many forms of proper contextualization, as Christina's just said, in order for these to serve an effect. If they're going to kind of repoliticize, they've got to be properly recontextualized. And perhaps, we need to use multimedia to do that, to capture responses and questions from people. And that seems really quite interesting, to get more public engagement. So Claire talks about the fact that the Victorian government has just launched a grant to create more monuments of women to try and even up the landscape. And she says, is this a good idea, or should we just move away from creating monuments to individuals, regardless of whatever their background is? What is this preoccupation with monuments themselves? So why do we need this figure, on the plinths or off the plinths, or, why not have group memorials, as I suggested in mine, or no memorials at all? What on earth? And it seems such a strange kind of preoccupation in itself. Civic spaces, do we really need monuments at all? Any thoughts from anyone?
Yeah, well, just to jump in, I mean, like that question, just jumping on that last question about do we need statues at all? I mean, I'm just thinking of what happened recently with the Princess Diana statue that was recently unveiled. And, there's all sorts of comments about, people's opinions about the statue. But I think underlying that was a question about, do we really need to have more statues? Is this an appropriate way to remember Princess Diana? Do we really need this? And I think it kind of took away from her memory, where all the focus ended up being about whether it's an ugly statue or whether it really expressed her persona and all this sort of stuff. So yeah, I think that there's a lot that's happened in the last couple of weeks has really helped with the thoughts about statues and why do we need them.
Well, I think what we've done tonight is just raise more and more questions. And I hope that you have found it to be a very rich discussion. There's been questions about intention, about re-signifying, about different forms of listening, different forms of acting, about thinking about the problematics of empty plinths and the vacuums of power, the vacuums that can come in there, and also different ways of learning to listen and deepen the conversation, to bring in more voices, to listen to more voices, and even those voices that are perhaps not particularly popular in this conversation, including those people who are defending some of the statues that are particularly offensive or contentious at the moment. So I hope that has been a very useful conversation. It's been provocative, perhaps, rather than conclusive, because I think that's what this topic is. I would urge you all to keep thinking about why now, because I think that is perhaps the question that won't get answered for quite some time, but it is the historian's question, why now? And it feels to me that we live in, in very interesting times, and times that we need to be moving fast, learning new skills of agility and receptivity and openness and curiosity. And I think this conversation, as all of our speakers have shown us tonight, reminded us, is one where we need to be extremely curious and open and alert and empathetic and creative and imaginative, and on it goes. So I would like to thank all of our speakers for their excellent provocations, and our contributors, and of course Paul Ashton for the remarkable person that he is, his generosity, his support for Mariko and I, and the rest of the contributors. Paul is just such a force in public history in this country and the world. We're very lucky. I'd also like to acknowledge the support of the New South Wales Government through Create New South Wales, and all the cultural partners and history supporters that the History Council is very lucky to have in our lives. And of course, the fantastic staff at the History Council, Catherine Shirley and Cassandra Rogers. I'd also like to remind you that History Week is coming up this year with the History Council. It's 4th to the 12th of September, and this year the theme feels very much like a statue war theme. In fact, the theme is, you can take it any way you like though, the theme is history from the ground up. So check out our website. We've talked about it a little bit more, give you lots of stimulation, lots of ideas. We think it's going to be a corker. We've got fantastic speakers for our annual history lecture, which is coming up, and one of them is Mariko. So if you like what you saw tonight, you're going to get a whole lot more of that. She's going to be fantastic. She's going to be talking with Laura McBride about Unsettled exhibition, which is just an extraordinary exhibition. So thank you again to all of you for rocking up tonight and asking your questions and engaging in this conversation. We hope you enjoy this special issue, and thank you again to our speakers and to all of you.
It's officially launched now.
Yay! I declare us launched. Bang!